in and have a seat. Would somebody get the people from the outside in here too? So we'll help inside out. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Nicolai Heering, an old friend of mine. Actually, we met through Liberty International many years ago, and he wrote Vince Miller and asked him, well, are there any libertarians in Hawaii that he could meet? And through our network, we were able to connect. We became fast friends. And then he took me journeying. We traveled across the Soviet Union on the Trans-Siberian Railway many years ago, about 1992, and had a lot of great adventures together. He's a great traveling department companion because all the time he's talking about intellectual ideas, all kinds of fun debates on whether or not, he asked me, well, if your daughter was in front of a bus, would you push the daughter out of the way and get run over by the bus? I said, well, of course I would. And he says, I wouldn't. I said, that's the kind of debate we had, yeah. At any rate, he has just sold his business that helped people register and do all the bureaucratic paperwork to register in England. He has quite a success. He's got some free time on his hands now to do other things, so please talk to him about that. And he's giving his presentation now. And by the way, this is the new corrected program for the rest of this afternoon. It's a little slightly different than the one in your printed program. So won't you welcome Nicolai Heering.
Thanks very much, Ken. Ken and I, we go back a long way. When I met Ken, his wife was pregnant with their daughter, Kenley. She was just a bump on Lee's belly, and she's now a 30-year-old lady, which makes me feel very old. Anyway, this presentation is going to be a bit different from the other ones. It's going to be a bit more old-fashioned, a bit more formal, because it is a written presentation. That's what works best for me, so, but I hope you will find the concepts interesting anyway. The definition of nationalism in Encyclopedia Britannica is, quote, an ideology based on the premise that the individual's loyalty and devotion to the nation-state surpass other individual or group interests, unquote. So why are so many people attracted to nationalism, given that it is an ideology that puts the state above the individual? It seems that it happens whenever people, quite naturally, look for a shared identity or bond with other individuals. Karl Popper, the famous 20th century philosopher, coined the desire to bond with other individuals as, quote, the spirit of the tribe, unquote. In Popper's view, the spirit of the tribe is the source of both nationalism and religious fanaticism. Maya Vargas Llosa, the Peruvian Nobel laureate in literature, investigates the concept further in his recent book entitled The Call of the Tribe. He writes, among other things, that, quote, the tribal spirit is the source of nationalism, which has been the culprit, together with religious fanaticism, of the biggest massacres in the history of mankind, unquote. The politicians and civil servants in positions of power, who all have a vested interest in the existence of a state, design the state as a receptacle for this tribal spirit. Flags, anthems, and national myths are all being used by politicians, powerful civil servants, and favored business corporations to make ordinary people identify themselves with the tribe, i.e. the nation-state. What politicians and civil servants want to achieve is that the individual becomes unable to distinguish between state and country, between state and society, and between state and individual. When that happens, people become nationalists. When the state becomes more powerful, nationalist individuals feel that they themselves, as persons, become more powerful. As the British author George Orwell wrote, quote, "The abiding purpose of every nationalist is to secure more power and more prestige, not for himself, but for the nation or other unit into which he has chosen to sink his own individuality." Unquote. This is somehow considered virtuous behavior by most people. As John F. Kennedy famously said, quote, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country," unquote. That quote is a prime example of nationalism, where the individual is asked to subordinate his own life to the needs of the state. But is the state really a community of willing individuals? The late Benedict Anderson, an Irish political scientist, did not think so. He described modern nations as, quote, "imagined communities," unquote. Imagined because people are drawn together within them who have not met and never will. In other words, people imagine that they have a lot in common with other people of the same nationality, but they will never know for sure because there's no way that each individual will ever get to meet more than a tiny fraction of the total number of their fellow countrymen. It is the power of such imagination that allows an essentially modern doctrine like nationalism to feel so deeply rooted in the past, which it is not. Nationalism increases in line with how serious an external threat is perceived as being. States make full use of this, creating or exaggerating external threats in order to increase their control and power over their citizens. In business parlance, this is also known as management by fear. Perceived external threats from other countries, which are almost always threats to the state, not threats to the country as such, are particularly useful when it comes to justifying compulsory military service, also known as national service, conscription, or the draft. National service is, of course, the forced training of young men to kill for the state, because that is what it really is when you think about it. Did Germany and Japan disappear off the face of the earth when they lost World War II? No. Apart from some relatively minor losses of territory, all that happened was that their governments changed. So all these young soldiers who, quote unquote, died for their country, did actually not die for their country. They killed and died simply to prevent a change of government. Obviously, this is not how it's portrayed by the media or by the state. As you know, the sixth commandment of the Bible is not, quote, "you shall not kill except as you kill for the state," unquote. How can the media and the state justify to a mother who has just lost her son in a battle that he just died to defend a bunch of megomaniac politicians rather than the country as such? They cannot. Therefore, they engage in the fairy tale make-believe illusions of dying or, quote unquote, falling for one's country. But nationalism doesn't just highlight the differences between countries, it also thrives on the anger within them. Michał Bielewicz, pardon my Polish pronunciation, a social psychologist at the University of Warsaw, explains this anger in terms of what his profession calls agency, by which he means the power to control your own life. Nationalism is determined not by patriotic ardor, he argues, but by self-esteem. Men and women lacking in, or deprived of, agency look to nationalism to reassure them that, in their own way, they're as good as anyone else, everyone else, better even. It's just that the world does not give them the respect they deserve. An example of this can be seen in a 2016 survey done in Saxony, one of the poorest parts of Germany. 18% of the 1,013 respondents fully or partially agreed with the statement that, quote, "Germans are naturally superior to other nationalities," unquote. So this sort of answer is coming from the poorest Germans who have little education and who have poorly paid or no jobs. How can they possibly feel that they are more successful than, say, the Swiss or the Japanese? Because nationalism provides them with a convenient and socially acceptable way to claim and make themselves believe that they, as individuals, deserve more respect for no other reason than they are German. In the words of an internet meme doing the rounds on Facebook, nationalism teaches you to take pride in stuff you haven't done and hate people you've never met. Interestingly, 29% of the respondents of the same survey also fully or partially agreed that Germany needs a dictatorship. 29%. 39% fully or partially agreed that all immigration of Muslims should be banned, and 58% fully or partially agreed that foreigners dominate Germany to a dangerous extent. This ties in with evidence that people who vote for nationalist parties are often from relatively poor rural or post-industrial areas with a surprisingly low number of immigrants. Those areas voted for UKIP in Britain and for Trump in the US. The same goes for countries as a whole. Only 1.7% of the Polish population were born outside of Poland. Yet, in Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and other Central European countries where the actual number of refugees and immigrants is extremely low compared to Western Europe, migrants are vilified like never before since World War II. The main conclusion one can draw from this is that the fewer immigrants you interact with in your daily lives, the easier it is to dehumanize and demonize them. The weird logic that you are better than others just because you are of a certain nationality is also what is behind the publicly expressed desire of many European politicians to boost birth rates. Birth rates are too low, the politicians say. We need to increase birth rates so that we get more Danes, Poles, Italians, or whatever the nationality is of the politician saying it, so that we can get more young workers to pay taxes in order to support the welfare state and the rising cost of state pensions for older people. This is quite literally National Socialism, as the same politicians deliberately disregard the obvious solution to the problem, which is to open up the borders. There are masses of fit, young, healthy people just south of the Mediterranean Sea who would like nothing more than to be allowed to do extremely hard work at extremely low wages. These are people who are ready to work from day one in the country. Unlike a newborn Dane or Pole or Italian, the immigrants do not need to first spend 15 to 20 years in kindergarten and school before they're ready to work. What's more, the International Monetary Fund calculated in 2016 that each 1% rise in the immigrant share of the population tends to raise income per inhabitant by 2%. So what's not to like? Sadly, logic plays no part in the minds of the nationalists. Several European countries are short of labour. I know for a fact that this is the case in both Denmark and the UK. Even so, extremely qualified foreigners are still denied access. Between December 2017 and March 2018, 1,226 IT specialists and 383 engineers were denied visas to take up jobs they had already been offered by UK businesses. In addition, 1,876 medical practitioners and healthcare workers, 197 teachers and 584 from other professions were unable to take up their job offers in the UK. The reason given was, quote, the number applying exceeded the monthly limit allowed to enter the UK, unquote. This insane policy was introduced by none other than Prime Minister Theresa May in her time as Home Secretary. So just because nationalist Daily Mail readers want less dark people in the UK, British businesses and the qualified people who want to work for them all have to suffer. Needless to say, this causes damage not only to the parties directly involved, but also to the national economy and the world economy as a whole, and thereby also to the racist nationalists who are the cause of such extremely damaging policies. Someone once said, nationalism always starts off with folk dancing and ends up with barbed wire. Although this is a slight exaggeration, there's much truth in that. Just within the past 100 years of European history, nationalism, combined with other collectivist ideologies and religions, has resulted in World War I in the 1910s, the Irish Civil War in the 1920s, the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, World War II in the 1940s, the Cypriot Civil War in the 1960s, the troubles in Northern Ireland and the partition of Cyprus in the 1970s, the Basque Guerrilla War in Spain in the 1980s, the Balkan Wars in the 1990s, the wars in the Caucasus in the 2000s, and the current conflict in eastern Ukraine, to name the ones that come to mind. Even now, European nationalism causes the deaths of thousands of people each year. I am, of course, referring to the people from Africa and Asia who seek a better life for themselves in Europe, or who simply try to survive by escaping from war and conflict. In 2013, 700 people drowned in the Mediterranean Sea trying to reach Europe. Since then, the number has risen every year. In 2016, the death toll was a shocking 5,143 dead individuals, including children. For comparison, the death toll in the 9/11 attack on the New York World Trade Center was 3,000. But it gets worse. The UN International Organization for Migration estimates that at least double the number of migrants that drowns in the Med dies in the Sahara on their way to the Med. That takes the death toll for 2016 to more than 15,000. This number includes many women and children who, as the physically weakest ones, are more likely victims of not only dehydration and exhaustion, but also robbery, rape, and murder. These people who died needlessly in the Med and the Sahara are people who could simply have purchased a cheap ticket on Ryanair or Wizz, and who would have been alive today had it not been for European immigration barriers. Immigration barriers which, in turn, are a direct result of nationalism and socialist welfare state policies. Sadly, all these deaths have not received anywhere nearly as much media attention as they should have. 10 people killed in a US school shooting gets way more attention in the European media than 500 people who drown in the Med right here on our doorstep. But it is a very, very ugly business. One particular sinking occurred on the 19th of April 2015 between Sicily and Libya, and saw more than 800 people dragged down to their deaths when their ship capsized. Italian Coast Guard divers subsequently dived the sunken ship in order to recover all the dead bodies. Among the horrific underwater scenery of 800 dead bodies, divers reported how they saw the body of a woman who had been giving birth on the lower deck of the ship when it sank, and she got trapped. The divers saw a dead body floating in the current, still attached to the dead mother by the umbilical cord. I've not been able to find a picture of this dead woman and her baby. But if you take nothing else away from this speech, this is the mental image that I would like you to remember every time you meet a nationalist who speaks out in favor of immigration restrictions. Make no mistake, nationalism means death, blood, and the destruction of innocent lives, even in this day and age. The European indifference to these deaths is caused, as I've suggested, by the existence of the European welfare states. Because Europeans, with some justification, expect their welfare state to collapse if an unlimited number of immigrants are allowed to claim tax-funded social benefits, unrestricted immigration is perceived as a threat to the national welfare states. So people just shrug it off and say that these deaths are a necessary evil. But the welfare state is not a necessary evil, it is an unnecessary evil. And therefore these deaths are completely pointless and unbelievably tragic. The existence of the welfare state quite clearly dehumanizes people. When the media showed a picture of a small dead boy in the arms of a Turkish border guard on a beach in Turkey back in 2016, there was a great outpouring of sympathy in Europe for the Syrian refugees. Why? Because the foreigners were suddenly given a human face by the media. A few months later, that sympathy had evaporated amidst reports of new refugee camps paid for by the welfare state, i.e. the European taxpayers. The so-called new patriotism argues that, quote, modern democratic states committed to a degree of equality rely on the willingness of citizens to make sacrifices for the common good, be it in terms of the everyday redistribution of income to meet welfare needs, or the provision of collective goods and services such as education or healthcare, unquote. My native Denmark is one of the European countries with the largest welfare state. It is also one of the countries in which the inhabitants identify themselves most strongly with the national welfare state. Most Danes, I'm not one of them, will tell you that they are proud of the Danish welfare state. Most Danes also see immigrants as a threat to that welfare state, and therefore as a threat to Denmark. Thus, I recently read an article by Mr. Munk Bobal, a candidate for parliament for the Conservative People's Party, which is generally considered to be only moderately right-wing. This party is in government at the moment. In the article, the candidate proposes to build Fortress Europe. As you may know, this term, Fortress Europe, was invented by Hitler's Nazi Germany to describe the defensive fortifications along the Atlantic coast during World War II. And here we have a so-called moderate politician who unashamedly uses the same terminology to propose keeping foreigners out of Europe. Unfortunately, it doesn't stop there. The leader of the largest political party in Denmark, Mrs. Frederiksen of the moderately left-wing Social Democrats, say that, quote, non-Western immigration is the biggest challenge for Denmark, unquote. This is obviously completely out of proportion. Other senior politicians from the Danish main party speak of, quote-unquote, self-defense when proposing further immigration restrictions. The terminology has become decidedly warlike. Speaking of defense, a private group of European so-called identitarians named Defend Europe last year chartered a ship at a cost of $178,000 in order to prevent private charities from rescuing migrants drowning in the Mediterranean Sea. The media backlash against this racist group has been very modest. The average citizen, and therefore also the media, is no longer appalled by public displays of hatred against immigrants. What was an extreme position 20 years ago has now become mainstream. Suddenly it is okay to be racist, Islamophobic, and nationalist, as long as you are so out of concern for the preservation of the nation state. Sadly, most Europeans see themselves as part of the nation state and perceive foreigners as a threat to that state, both economically and culturally. A clear example of this is the new Italian Nationalist Populist government, which in June this year followed in the footsteps of the Defend Europe identitarians by refusing the private charity ship MS Aquarius with 629 refugees rescued from the sea permission to dock in Italy. The result was an instant increase in support for the extreme nationalists in the governing political party called Liga, or it used to be Liga Nord. This has been followed by the rejection of several other refugee ships and talk from Liga's leader, Interior Minister Salvini, about defending Europe. Salvini also wants to, quote-unquote, cleanse Italy of Romas, or gypsies, without Italian citizenship, and create a special register for the Italian Romas. Next, they'll probably be made to wear the Roma equivalent of a yellow star. Unfortunately, nationalism doesn't stop with its xenophobia. Like Trump, the new Italian government is also protectionist and consequently want to repeal the free trade agreement that is currently in force between the EU and Canada. In Poland, state-owned companies are buying up banks just to ensure that they're Polish-owned. The Polish government also wants to renationalize things as diverse as shipbuilding, the provision of medicine, and the publication of newspapers. Although the Polish government is generally considered right-wing, it favors economic intervention and expansion, not reduction of the socialist welfare state. This is what they call, quote-unquote, economic patriotism and, quote-unquote, pride in Polish companies. So, as Mario Vargas Llosa says, the great danger in our age is nationalism. It's no longer fascism or communism, unquote. These days, the most successful nationalist parties, in fact the most successful parties in general, are not the traditional fascist or ultra-conservative parties. Instead, a new wave of nationalist populism has been sweeping across Europe in recent years. This populism is difficult to pin down in the traditional two-dimensional left-right political spectrum, as it borrows views from both the left and the right. But unlike libertarianism, which combines the very best traits from the left and the right, the nationalist populism combines the very worst. Populist nationalists are, like the socialists, generally in favor of large welfare states, against free trade, austerity, balanced budgets, and globalization. Like conservatives, they are in favor of more surveillance, more police, and harder borders, and are against immigration, immigrants, Muslims, and the free movement of labor, i.e. people. These are much the same views as those held by the nationalists in the 1920s and 30s, except that the new nationalists tend to target Muslims instead of Jews. As an aside, I think it's interesting to note that to what extent that the aims and goals of the jihadists and the radical Muslims, which, don't forget, are a tiny minority of the total number of Muslims in the world, coincide with the aims and goals of the European nationalists. The fact is that they both want to incite as much hatred as possible between Muslims and non-Muslims. They both know that this is the only way they can gain more followers and more support. Every time the European media overflows with sympathy for victims of terrorism committed by extremists, both these groups secretly rejoice. The nationalists because people will flock to their cause, and the jihadists because innocent Muslims in Europe will henceforth be subjected to even more hatred by the native Europeans. These hitherto innocent Muslims will hate those native Europeans right back, and therefore become ideal subjects for radicalization by the jihadists. And so the vicious circle takes another turn. Going back to the differences between nationalists and libertarians, the only point on which they often, but not always, agree is the need for tax cuts. That's pretty much the only good thing that people like Viktor Orban and Donald Trump have done, both of them typical populist nationalists, is to cut income taxes. However, left-leaning nationalists like the Scottish and Catalan nationalists are in favor of raising taxes, and even right-leaning nationalists are often in favor of raising tariffs, which are, of course, also taxes. The Italian national elections in 2018 show quite clearly the breakdown of the traditional left-right political axis. Right-wing parties proposed higher state-funded universal income than the left-wing parties, and were happy to propose expanding the budget deficit by increasing public spending while at the same time lowering taxes. It seems counterintuitive that parties with simplistic policies such as these should become more popular now that people are generally better educated than ever before. What has not changed, however, is that many people devote little time and effort to studying politics in depth or to considering the implications of the policies that they vote for. Most people have busy lives, and they know intuitively that their chances of influencing their lives by voting is infinitely small. According to Jim Messina, a former Barack Obama strategist, the average voter thinks about politics for 4 minutes a week. In such a short space of time, simple tunes do best. Therefore, the voters tend to go with the slogans that at first glance seem to accurately highlight problems or provide solutions to whatever dominates the news. The modern politicians know this and simply tell voters what they want to hear, whatever the consequences. Another one who knows this is Steve Bannon, the outright media executive who is also a former chief strategist of the Trump administration and probably the most undesirable American export ever. Since he left the White House, he has been spending time in Europe actively looking to establish a pan-European nationalist populist organization called The Movement in order to ensure that nationalism and racism, even more so than now, becomes the mainstream socially acceptable norm. As he said in a speech to the French National Front back in March, quote, "Let them call you racists, let them call you xenophobes, let them call you nativists. Wear it as a badge of honor," unquote. But how bad is the situation really right now? It's pretty bad. The dehumanization of immigrants and Muslims go hand in hand with the new trade tariffs against the US, new immigration barriers against Africa and the Middle East, and the reintroduction of national service in Sweden, France, and Lithuania. I prepared a map. Here, let me see if I can bring that up. There we are. I'm not sure I can get it bigger than that, but anyway. This map shows where nationalism has, in my opinion, reached extremely alarming proportions. I've based the map on the electoral support for those political parties that have, in my subjective view, recently expressed populist nationalist or extreme nationalist views. I've colored the map in traffic light colors to indicate the degree of nationalist further across the continent, with green showing the least afflicted countries. If you look at specific countries, you will see that some of the very worst are currently Hungary, Austria, and Italy. In Hungary, as I think another shows. The number's probably too small to read. Can I enlarge it? Oh yes, down there. Is that the one?
Yeah.
Anyway, in Hungary, just the right-wing nationalists alone account for 68% of the electorate. That was achieved on a campaign of scaremongering about immigrants, of which, as I mentioned before, there are precious few in Hungary. In Austria, the nationalist chancellor, Sebastian Kurz, has recently proposed an quote-unquote axis of Germany, Italy, and Austria to curb illegal immigration. And yes, he did use the term axis. Disregarding Japan, these countries were exactly those that formed the original Axis powers in September 1940. Hungary joined the Axis powers in November 1940. All this may just be a coincidence, but I do find the historical similarities to the proposed Axis of 2018 rather scary. Anyway, when looking at a regional level, nationalism has also reached high levels in some places, with the Basque Country, Catalonia, Corsica, and Northern Ireland all at well over 50% of the vote, and Bavaria and Scotland very close to 50%. Obviously, all these figures do not provide the full picture, since nationalist anti-immigrant sentiments have also infected moderate right-wing parties and have even reached deep into left-wing parties that were traditionally more tolerant towards immigrants. The most notorious example of nationalism is, of course, National Socialism, also known as Nazism. Although I presume that no one in this room needs convincing that Nazism is bad, I think it is instructive to compare the policies of National Socialism with the welfare state patriotism that is on the rise in Europe in these years. According to National Socialism, the nation state is the most important entity in life, and although businesses and individuals should be allowed a certain amount of freedom, these should always be subordinated to the needs of the state. The German National Socialism of the 1930s promoted a welfare state that included a national labor service, state-provided healthcare, and guaranteed pensions, to name but a few of their collectivist policies. Hitler distrusted capitalism for being unreliable due to its individualism, and he preferred a state-directed economy subordinated to the interests of the nation-state. Hitler declared that, quote, every activity and every need of every individual will be regulated by the collectivity represented by the party, unquote. And that, quote, there are no longer any free realms in which the individual belongs to himself, unquote. Reichskommissar Himmler justified the establishment of a repressive police state in which the security forces could exercise power arbitrarily by claiming that national security and order should take precedence over the needs of the individual. Nazi Germany successfully dehumanized and demonized the Jews, the gays, the Romas, and just about every other small minority you can think of. The new nationalists in Europe and the US are successfully dehumanizing and demonizing migrants and Muslims. Different targets, same principle. Demonizing groups of people that are unable to defend themselves gives the native voters a sense of shared purpose and thereby a shared identity. It's us, the quote-unquote civilized European welfare states, against them, the quote-unquote uncivilized hordes of foreigners from Africa and the Middle East. The migrants, most of whom have no right to vote, have no recourse and are unable to properly defend themselves in the public sphere. That makes them ideal scapegoats for the nationalist populists, in the same way that the so-called subhuman Jews were the scapegoats of the National Socialists. Interestingly, even most of the German soldiers in the Jew-murdering Einsatzgruppen on the Eastern Front during World War II were, in fact, initially decent people. Many had families and children of their own, and several of the officers held postgraduate degrees. But like the German civilians, they were brainwashed into identifying themselves with the German state to such an extent that they sincerely thought what they were doing was for the good of the nation, and therefore, by extension, for the good of themselves. As I said earlier, states aim to make their citizens unable to distinguish between individual and state, between individual and country, and between the individual and society. So disobeying the nation-state of which they considered themselves an integral part did not seem like an option to most Germans. It was the German nation against the Untermenschen, the so-called subhumans, and in the minds of the Nazis, killing these so-called subhumans, i.e. Jews, Slavs, Romas, etc., was unpleasant but necessary in order to defend the nation and thereby themselves and their families. Unfortunately, I see very unpleasant echoes of this mindset in the Europe of 2018, where talk of building Fortress Europe and quote-unquote defending Europe against migrants is generally accepted. The spirit of the tribe is alive and well. In the beginning of this speech, I mentioned the definition of nationalism in Encyclopedia Britannica, which is, quote, an ideology based on the premise that the individual's loyalty and devotion to the nation-state surpass other individual or group interests, unquote. Just from this one definition, it should be clear that nationalism is the antithesis of liberty. You cannot claim to support the freedom of the individual and at the same time defend the existence of a powerful nation-state. The concept of individual liberty is diametrically opposed to the concept of nationalism. In the end, it's all about control. Should you control your own life, or should the state? The slogan that probably won the UK Brexit referendum for the Leave side back in 2016 was the term taking back control. The Brexiteers spoke about taking back control of our borders, taking back control of our laws, taking back control from Brussels, etc., ad nauseam. Whichever spin doctor came up with the term taking back control probably deserved his bonus, as it was extremely effective. However, I actually agree. I agree that we should take back control. But by that I mean that we should take back control from the state. The state, on the other hand, should not take back control of anything whatsoever. Nationalism discriminates individuals on the basis of their nationality, not on the basis of the qualities of each individual. Given that people have very little influence over which nationality they have, this amounts to extreme discrimination. It will happen often that talented people are discriminated against and untalented people are rewarded solely on the basis of the nationality. As I grow older, I have started to notice how utterly unique each and every human being is, and how difficult it is, or should be, to pigeonhole any one individual. Humans are incredibly complex, and if some seem similar, it's only because they put on a facade that will enable them to interact with their peers more easily. Go out into the street, choose any random person, and ask for their life story. Then do the same again. I can almost guarantee you that one life story will be very different from the next. In my experience, each life story, especially those that cover many years, would qualify for its own Hollywood movie. The deeper you dig, the more fascinating a person becomes. It is said that when a person dies in old age, the brain contains data that corresponds in size to the contents of a medium-sized public library. This combination of information, feelings, memories, music, opinions, images, and much more is absolutely unique to each and every individual. Therefore, it is an immense injustice to collectively judge any individual on the basis of their nationality, religion, or skin color. And that is exactly what nationalism does. It judges people collectively, not individually. That is why the term right-wing collectivism is so very appropriate to describe nationalism. In conclusion, I would say that people should satisfy their natural desire for belonging to a group by supporting groups that are less lethal and less destructive than nation-states. These could be groups with shared interest in languages, traditions, sports, or any other subject. It is not a necessity of life that you identify yourself with a nation-state, although for the past couple of centuries, we have pretty much all been brought up to do so. I'm a citizen of two states, Denmark and the UK. So where does my loyalty lie, you may ask? Well, I'll tell you, it lies with myself. The reason I have two passports is simply that it gives me more freedom than just having one. When I'm asked which country I'm from, which happens frequently when one travels, I'm sometimes tempted to reply to the person asking, that is none of his business. But although I've never actually said that, I don't really want people to judge me on the basis of which passport I happen to carry. People tend to keep in their minds little virtual boxes with the names of countries on them and a certain set of preconceptions, generalizations, and prejudices about people from that country. Now, I do not want to be put in a box like that as part of the very first interaction that I have with a given person. Rather than be judged on my nationality, I want to be judged on my personal characteristics. There are many different kinds of nationalism, but they all have one thing in common. The individual is always subject to the will of the state. That is why nationalism, even the more innocuous sounding patriotism, is not and can never be a philosophy of liberty. The single individual, not the collective, and therefore not the state, is and must always be the supreme entity. Thank you. Have some questions? Mary?
Yes, I wanted to make sure I understood you correctly. About 13 minutes into your talk, I thought you said that each 1% of earnings by migrants gives the people in the country an additional 2% of earnings. Did I hear that right? And if I did, can you explain how that happens?
Yeah, let me just find that exact phrase.
I think it's 13 minutes into your talk is what
Okay.
I marked down. I don't know if that helps.
What was it, 14? Yeah, 13.
Sorry about that. I mean, I'm just like, you know, I thought I heard that, and I've never heard that before, and I want to understand it, so.
Yeah, I got the figure. I think it might have been from the UN Institute for Migration, but I can get back to you on that.
Yes, I'd appreciate it. I mean, if you can't find it now, you can email me. I'd really, really appreciate it.
Sure, I will. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I congratulate you on a well-researched and presented paper.
Thank you.
I think in your attribution of almost all the world's ills to nationalism,
And socialism.
you may have overstepped that a bit, confusing some cause and effect. For example, you mentioned the Middle Eastern problem, Iran, and so forth. That's not a nationalism issue at all, it's a religious issue.
Culture, is it culture?
Yeah.
If you look at, if you look to the United States, which I'm far more familiar with than I am with Europe, I bow to your superior knowledge there. But the desire to defend borders against illegal immigration is not a nationalist issue. It's primarily a political issue of wishing not to encourage additional socialism, which will come about because of that immigration. It's a desire to keep our individuality. And I could go on and on with examples like that. But I think nationalism also has had some very positive impacts on the world. As we built our country, it was built on the basis of national pride and building something that we could all as individuals be proud of. And I think our country has had a good effect on the rest of the world through its democratic processes. Which I would have to quickly say is a republic, not a democracy. So I don't give the Democratic Party any credit. But I think you have just maybe focused too much on nationalism as an issue when there are really more underlying causes, such as religion and other matters, economic differences. And I very much would not like to see it be a one-world society without national borders. I think we all benefit from having individual identities as nations, and that the competition between nations should be quite healthy. I realize that sometimes competition goes too far, goes to war, but short of that, I think competition is always a good thing. And I'll quit talking, I'm making a speech now.
Yeah.
Respond, Nicolai.
I think that my response to that would encompass the entirety of my speech. I just want to point out that you're right in saying that in the Middle East, religion often takes precedence over nationalism, but my speech is specifically about Europe. You have a question?
Yes, I do. Could you elucidate a little more on your concept of private property, if it's something that you acknowledge exists or is possible or is valid morally? And if so, how does that relate to, if you extend that, in other words, I have my private property with my house, but also a community that I support, and a state and a country and so on, and if someone comes, what is the difference between someone stepping on the private property of a country and intruding on the private property of a city, and then coming to my house, and where does private property begin or end, or even exist in your mind?
A country can't have private property. That's not what private means. It's state property if
It
it's.
belongs to someone.
It's the state, right? Does a state lawfully own property? Like if I want Mexicans to come onto my property and I want to pay them a certain wage, is that your business?
That wasn't the question.
Well, I think it's my property though. If it happens to be on your border, it's still my property, right?
No, I'm asking where does private property, let him answer that, your question, yeah.
In relation to immigration?
In relation to immigration, because immigrants are coming onto theoretically private property when they enter another country. You could think that, because by an extension, that is owned and paid for collectively by the people that live there. So is there a difference between somebody's yard, somebody's house, somebody's bedroom, or somebody's city or city-state? Question.
Well, I'm a great believer in private property rights, but your private property stops at your front door. Simple as that. And you do not have a right to block other people from allowing people into their homes from whichever country. Airports are in many cases private businesses, and I think private businesses should be allowed to decide who they want to allow onto their property and who they don't. I suspect that most airports would want as many customers as possible, so that's one reason why I think it would be wrong, morally wrong, for the state to impose restrictions on businesses and individuals on who they can receive on their premises and in their homes. Yes?
I've noticed that in your speech, in your definition of nationalism, you strongly tied nationalism to the existence of a state. However, as we know, there have been and there still are states of many nations. And I think there are still some nations spread amongst some states. So, would you say that all in-group preference is bad and has no place and no positive effect on our civilization?
No, I'm all for group decisions and group identity as long as it's voluntary. That's the important point. It must be voluntary. Yeah, you're right. I mean, not all states are nation states. There are states which consist of several smaller nation states. I mean, in Europe, Belgium and Switzerland come to mind. They're actually not nation states as such. They are comprised of different ethnicities. But I find it slightly amusing when I see how the state tries to justify itself by using flags and anthems and national myths and legends to justify confining these different ethnicities into a particular state. It's all a big illusion, if you ask me. I don't know who was first. Yes?
Just a quick comment about that. Germany was not a nation until Bismarck and the Prussians, but it was a culture. People recognized Germany as a culture, and the same would be true for Italy in the 19th century with this. So a nation state doesn't require a culture. I mean, a culture doesn't require a nation state. Would this support your argument or not support your argument?
The size of the entity doesn't really matter. I mean, before 1871 you had lots of little German states. Even today you have ethnic Germans in Germany and in Austria and in Switzerland and in some other places. So the
point is that the German identity is real to the people who live in that culture, but it doesn't require a nation for them to have that.
Oh no, I agree with that. I agree with that. Yes, I mean, you can certainly have a shared identity without having a strong state. That is one of the points of my speech. Yes.
Or no state.
Yes, on state indeed. Yes?
I think a fairly respectable libertarian-like strategy for the political scene is decentralization. And the smaller governing hierarchy that you can come up with, the more responsive it's going to be to the citizens there. So in terms of continental Europe and the European Union and Brexit and all, isn't that a possible way that we will have less state tyranny by splitting that up, instead of having Belgium and the EU making regulations for everybody in the European community?
It's a bit of a two-edged sword. If you split nations into ever smaller units, you run the risk of these small units actually erecting trade barriers and barriers to this and that, which is not a good thing for world trade. But I agree, I mean, if we can get down to the smallest possible entity, which I think is an individual, that would be great. Yes?
I have a quick follow-up on the comments about linking nationalism into state, which means, well, basically monopoly of power. So we were talking a lot about internal mechanisms that strengthen nationalist feelings, but when it's actually linked with military strength, then you also need to remember that there can be all sorts of international propaganda, in the sense that, for example, it could be in the interest of Russians to have a lot of Polish nationalists so they can invoke anti-Ukrainian feelings. This is just one example that strikes close to home, but I guess with national state like this, you will have such stories all over the world, because there are a lot of possibilities to invoke such feelings. So sometimes it's even international propaganda and this sort of information war that wants to have more nationalists in other states that may turn against their enemies. So this is also a mechanism you could look into.
Yeah, I mean, I'm against nationalism, whether it originates locally or externally. It doesn't really matter to me. Yes?
The question of how would you answer, the challenge seems to be tremendously not only cultural but also economic. How do you deal with the problem of rent seeking from people who are coming from poor countries into wealthier countries like the United States, where they're entitled to the social benefits of the United States, or like into many countries in the European Union? How do you prevent that process if it's something that you want to prevent? And the answer question, the second part of that is does the collective group of people who are electing the politicians in control of their state have the ability to say, we want to allow in people with PhDs rather than people who are farm workers? Or we want to allow in people who are farm workers and exclude people who have PhDs? In other words, is there any mechanism to balance the economic desire for people to lead a better life and in the process obtain the benefits of the other country, which they otherwise wouldn't be entitled to?
Well, I don't really want to get too much into the mechanics of how to have immigration barriers, because I don't believe in immigration barriers, period. If unrestricted immigration makes the welfare state break down, I would cheer. I would like that. And in fact, I think that would be one of the only things that could force the politicians away from the status quo, force them to fundamentally rethink the whole concept of welfare states and who should be entitled to social benefits and who shouldn't. In terms of the kind of immigrants that are decided, it varies from one country to another. I mean, I know that in some European countries there is actually a scarcity of unskilled labor rather than skilled labor. And there's plenty of unskilled labor on tap. You just need to let it get in.
The market, isn't it?
And I had one other point which I've forgotten. I'll get back to that.
Well, maybe next time, because we already ran out of time. Thank you.